The night was quiet, too quiet for the back roads of southern Alabama. Crickets had gone silent, and even the wind seemed to hesitate, as if nature itself sensed what was about to unfold. Headlights cut through the darkness, crawling along a dirt path lined with towering pines and rusted signs that whispered of a town long forgotten. Inside an old pickup truck, laughter broke the silence, rough, cruel, and certain. They'd been following him for miles, their voices thick with hate, their confidence fueled by ignorance. To them, he was just another black man who had wandered too far into their land. They had no idea the man walking calmly along that road had spent 15 years in the shadows, serving, surviving, and commanding the world's deadliest missions. Miles Hawk Carter didn't run. He never did. The former Delta Force commander had seen fear in its purest form, in jungles, deserts, and war zones, but never let it rule him. As the truck slowed, floodlights flaring behind him, Miles exhaled softly. His instincts sharpened, his muscles relaxed. What they saw as prey was a predator in disguise. And before the night was over, every man who came hunting him would learn. Sometimes the strongest weapon isn't vengeance. It's restraint sharpened by experience. Would the same mercy be shown tonight? Only the dark could answer that. The moon hung low, spilling silver light across the cracked asphalt as Miles continued walking toward the faint glow of town lights ahead. His boots pressed into the dust, unhurried, each step deliberate, measured. Behind him, the old pickup truck rolled slower now, the hum of its engine blending with muffled laughter and the faint clinking of bottles. Miles knew their type. He'd seen men like them in war, angry, insecure, drawn to chaos because it made them feel powerful. But this wasn't a battlefield, and these weren't soldiers. They were just lost souls trying to prove something hollow. The town he'd entered that evening, Hollow Ridge, was the kind of place time forgot. A single diner, a faded gas station, and houses that leaned with age. He wasn't here by accident. He had driven across 3 states to visit the resting place of a man who once saved his life, a fellow soldier buried in a quiet cemetery behind the church. Miles believed in honoring his fallen brothers, even when no one else did. He had parked his car miles back, choosing to walk the last stretch alone. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was trust issues. But deep down, Miles knew peace was a fragile thing, especially in towns like this, where some men still whispered about bloodlines and heritage like it gave them purpose. As he passed the dimly lit diner, a few heads turned behind dusty glass. The chatter softened. Eyes lingered longer than necessary. It wasn't curiosity, it was suspicion wrapped in prejudice. A man in a cap spat on the floor, muttering something to the waitress who quietly lowered her gaze. Miles ignored it. He'd seen enough of humanity to know that not everyone could be reasoned with. When he reached the church, the air grew still. The small iron gate creaked as he pushed it open. Fireflies blinked among the gravestones. He found the marker easily, Sergeant Leon Brick Walker. His best friend, the man who once dragged him from the wreckage of an ambushed convoy overseas. Miles knelt, brushing away a layer of dust from the carved letters. "I made it, brother," he whispered under his breath. "Didn't forget." A minute of silence passed before he heard it, the low growl of an engine returning. The same truck, the same men. This time they weren't just following, they were circling. The crunch of gravel broke the peace as headlights swept across the cemetery fence. 4 figures stepped out, their voices cutting through the night like barbed wire. "Well, well," one of them drawled. "Ain't often we get visitors this late. Especially your kind." Miles straightened slowly, his hands still relaxed at his sides. He said nothing. Another voice, younger, louder, tried to sound brave. "You lost, boy? You people don't usually come walking around here after dark unless you're looking for trouble." The eldest of the group leaned against the truck, smirking. He had the swagger of someone used to control, a self-appointed leader of men who needed direction. "Thing is," he said, "we don't take kindly to strangers, especially ones sneaking around our churchyard." Miles' eyes drifted to the horizon, calculating distances, noting exits, measuring light. His calm unnerved them. He had faced armed insurgents who didn't scare him. 4 drunken racists barely registered as a threat. But still, he didn't want bloodshed. Not here. Not on Leon's grave. "I'm just paying my respects," he said quietly, his voice level and steady. The words seemed to agitate them more. One of the younger men kicked a stone. "Paying respects to who? That one of yours?" Miles nodded once. "He was my brother." That word, brother, hung in the air like a challenge. The leader's face twisted. "Ain't no brother of yours buried here, boy. Not in this town." Miles sighed, a quiet exhale of patience running thin. He looked back at Leon's headstone, murmuring softly, "Guess some things never change." That subtle defiance made them step closer. The leader raised his chin. "You talking smart to me?" Miles didn't answer. He turned, intending to leave, but the sound of a shotgun pumping froze him mid-step. The leader smirked. "Nah, you ain't leaving yet. We're going to teach you a lesson before you crawl out of here." The others grinned, circling like wolves who thought they'd cornered a lamb. But they didn't see the shift in his posture, the subtle realignment of a soldier's stance, the way his feet angled for leverage, or the calm in his breathing. Miles Carter wasn't just trained for combat. He was trained for survival. He could take them apart in less than 30 seconds. But something held him back. Maybe it was Leon. Maybe it was the promise he'd made years ago to never become what he fought against. The leader barked, "Get him!" And just like that, the night broke open. They rushed him, but what happened next would leave Hollow Ridge haunted for generations. The first man lunged, swinging a rusted tire iron toward Miles's head. It was a sloppy move, telegraphed, unbalanced. Miles stepped aside with military precision, catching the man's wrist mid-swing and twisting it until the bone cracked like a dry branch. The weapon clattered to the dirt. Another charged in from behind, shouting something ugly, but Miles pivoted, driving his elbow into the man's ribs, then sweeping his leg out from under him. "Two down," the night echoed with panic. What they thought would be easy dominance was slipping fast into chaos. The leader yelled, "Get him, you idiots!" while fumbling for his shotgun. But Miles was already moving, silent, calculating, a storm contained within calm flesh. He closed the distance in 3 strides, gripping the barrel and twisting it upward just as the man pulled the trigger. The blast split the air, lighting the trees. Pellets scattered harmlessly into the night sky. Miles disarmed him with surgical efficiency, then drove his knee into the man's gut, sending him sprawling. The last attacker froze, uncertain now. He had a knife, but his hand trembled. You ain't normal," he stammered. Miles' expression never changed. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm trained." That line, simple, unshaken, cut deeper than any weapon could. The man dropped the knife and ran into the trees, stumbling into the dark. Within seconds, silence returned. The only sound was the wind through the grass and the low groan of men who thought hate made them strong. Miles stood among them, unarmed, untouched, heart steady. He looked down at the broken shotgun at his feet, then at the headstone nearby. "Not tonight, Leon," he murmured. "Not like this." He could have left them there, but he knew how these stories twisted. In towns like Hollow Ridge, justice wasn't blind, it was biased. He couldn't afford to walk away from a scene that would later be painted as an attack. So, he did what a soldier always does. He assessed, strategized, and acted. He pulled their truck keys from the ignition, tossed them into the tall grass, and dragged the weapons into the open. Then he took photos. Every face, every weapon, every piece of evidence. Years of covert ops had taught him the importance of proof. As the groaning men stirred, Miles knelt beside the one who'd fired the shotgun. "You need to listen," he said, voice low but firm. "You think tonight was about power. But power isn't what you have, it's what you understand." The man blinked through pain and confusion. You could have killed us." "I know," Miles replied. "But then I'd be like you." He rose, leaving them where they lay, and walked back toward the road. The distant sound of sirens began to rise. Someone must have called the sheriff. Miles didn't hurry. He'd faced interrogation rooms that were colder than this night ever could be. Minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the road ahead. The sheriff stepped out, gray-haired, heavy-set, wary. "Sir, we got reports of an altercation." You okay? Miles nodded. 4 men attacked me in the cemetery. They're still there. Weapons on the ground. You'll want to secure the area. The sheriff hesitated, studying him. You sure you didn't provoke 'em? That familiar sting of prejudice pulsed through the air. Miles met his gaze evenly. No, Sheriff. I was paying respects to a fallen soldier. You'll find my ID in my wallet. Retired Delta Force Commander, U.S. Army. The man's eyes flickered with disbelief. Then something shifted. Delta Force? Yes, sir. Miles's voice carried quiet authority. I'm not here for trouble. But your men need to start asking why this keeps happening in your county. For a moment, silence hung heavy. The sheriff radioed his deputies, voice low. Secure the suspects, call for medical, and run a record check on a Commander Miles Carter, military ID Alpha 709. As he spoke, the men from the truck were loaded into separate vehicles. One of them, barely conscious, muttered, "He ain't human! He's something else." Miles turned away, his silhouette framed by flashing lights. The sheriff approached him again, this time softer. You could have hurt him bad. Why didn't you? Miles glanced toward the cemetery. Because my brother's buried there. He died protecting freedom. If I spill blood over hate, I dishonor everything he stood for. The sheriff looked down, ashamed. You got somewhere to stay tonight? I'll find a place, Miles said, starting to walk. But you should fix what's broken in this town. It's not the roads, it's the hearts. He disappeared into the darkness beyond the headlights, leaving the sheriff staring after him, unsure whether he'd just met a man or a legend. Later that night, in a small roadside motel, Miles sat by the window, staring at the empty highway. His knuckles were bruised, his mind clear. The encounter had stirred memories he'd buried deep, memories of other nights, in other countries, when men with different flags had hunted him for different reasons. Hate had no uniform, he realized. It only needed an excuse. He pulled out a folded photograph from his wallet, him and Leon, grinning in their fatigues, sand and sweat on their faces. You'd laugh at this one, Brick, he whispered. You'd say ain't nothing changes, brother. Miles smiled faintly. Maybe one day it will. The next morning, a story broke on local news. 4 men hospitalized after attacking decorated war veteran. It spread fast, across states, across social media. Photos surfaced of Miles standing quietly beside the sheriff's car, his expression calm, unbothered. But it wasn't the headlines that mattered, it was the conversations. For once, people were asking the right questions. Why did this happen? How many more quiet towns hid this sickness beneath the surface? Miles didn't stick around to answer. He packed his bag, paid his motel bill, and drove off before sunrise. He wasn't chasing fame or pity. He had a mission, one that no badge, uniform, or medal could define. As his truck rolled over the state line, sunlight painted the horizon gold. He glanced at the sky and whispered, Rest easy, brother. I did it right this time. Behind him, Hollow Ridge stirred awake to a truth it couldn't ignore. The story of the night they tried to kill a black man and learned he was a Delta Force commander would echo far beyond its borders. And somewhere in the quiet between justice and mercy, Miles Carter kept moving, because warriors never stop fighting. They just choose their battles differently. The road stretched endlessly before him, but peace never came easy to men who had seen too much. Miles Carter had driven hundreds of miles from Hollow Ridge, yet the echoes of that night followed him like distant thunder. Every headline, every news report, his name, his story, had become a symbol of something larger than himself. But fame was never what he wanted. He wanted understanding, change, a shift so deep that maybe, just maybe, no other man would ever be hunted for the color of his skin again. A week later, as he reached Atlanta, he stopped at a Veterans Outreach Center he'd helped fund years ago. The sign outside read, Project Rebuild Healing Soldiers, Healing Streets. Inside, young men of all colors worked side by side, fixing broken furniture, repairing homes for the poor, and sharing meals with those society had forgotten. Miles had built this place to give others what the battlefield never could, peace with purpose. But even there, the world found him. A black SUV pulled up outside, tinted windows gleaming. Two men in suits stepped out, followed by a familiar face, the sheriff from Hollow Ridge. Miles met him halfway across the lot, suspicion softening into wary respect. "Commander Carter," the sheriff began, removing his hat. "I had to see you again. Things changed after you left. The town's talking. The governor called me personally. Said to thank you for how you handled things." Miles nodded, silent. "But there's something else," the sheriff added. "Those men, two of them confessed everything. The assaults, the threats, even a few missing persons cases we never solved. You didn't just defend yourself, you cracked open a case that's been buried for years." Miles exhaled, the weight of the words settling in. "Then it wasn't about me," he said quietly. "It was about truth finally catching up." The sheriff nodded. "Truth needed someone to face it without hate. You did that." He extended his hand, a gesture that months ago would have been unthinkable. Miles shook it, his grip firm but calm. Before they parted, the sheriff said, "You know, folks started asking questions about the Delta Force, about what kind of man fights the world and still chooses mercy. You changed more than just our town, Carter." Miles gave a small smile. "Change isn't mine to claim. It's everyone's to carry." That night, alone again, Miles sat outside the center beneath a canopy of stars. The hum of traffic blended with the whisper of wind through the pines. He thought about Leon, about all the men and women who had died believing that someday equality wouldn't be a dream but a reality. His phone buzzed. A message, unknown number. "Commander Carter, this is Major Grant. The department's requesting your insight for a special briefing. Civil resilience operations. We need leaders who can calm chaos before it spreads. You in?" Miles stared at the screen for a long moment. After years of war, he had learned that not every battle used bullets. Some used understanding, patience, and courage. He typed back a single word: always. 2 days later, he stood in Washington, D.C., addressing a hall filled with military leaders, journalists, and community advocates. Cameras rolled, but his voice never wavered. "I've seen what hate does on foreign soil," he began. "It burns villages, divides armies, poisons hearts. But when it grows at home, inside neighborhoods, inside minds, it destroys us quietly. You don't defeat hate by returning it. You defeat it by exposing it, by refusing to be its mirror." The room was silent, every ear tuned to him. "I didn't fight 4 men in a cemetery that night," Miles continued. "I fought what made them. Fear, ignorance, a belief passed down that difference is danger. But the truth is, difference is strength. I learned that serving alongside soldiers from every color, every faith, every background, you bleed the same, you cry the same, and if you're lucky, you learn to heal the same." He paused, scanning the room. "We can train warriors, but what we need now are guardians, men and women who fight for decency, not dominance." When he stepped down, the applause was quiet but powerful, not the cheer of spectacle, but the sound of understanding. People rose to their feet not out of pity, but respect. That night, as he left the hall, he passed by a reporter waiting outside. She lowered her microphone and simply said, "You changed the story, Commander. You showed the world what strength looks like when it refuses to hate back." Miles smiled faintly. Maybe the world just needed a reminder. Outside, the night sky glowed with the faintest trace of dawn. The darkness was breaking, not just over the city, but perhaps over the hearts of those willing to see. And as the first light spilled across the horizon, Miles Carter walked into it, steady, unafraid, carrying with him the quiet truth that power isn't found in how loud you strike, but in how calmly you stand when the world tries to break you. The world didn't change overnight, but Hollow Ridge did. Weeks after the attack, the town that once hid behind silence began facing itself in the mirror. Churches spoke against hate for the first time in years. The diner that once turned away strangers opened a free breakfast program for veterans of all colors. Even the sheriff, once slow to believe, stood before his own deputies and said, "Justice doesn't wear skin, it wears courage." And yet Miles Carter had already moved on. That's what men like him did: serve, teach, disappear. He returned to the quiet rhythms of rebuilding lives, one person at a time. His outreach center grew. Former soldiers who'd once drowned in anger began finding purpose in helping others. Some had scars on their bodies, others on their hearts. But under his guidance, they learned that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant transforming pain into strength. Late one evening, Miles stood on the rooftop of the center, the city lights stretching beneath him like constellations. A young volunteer, a teenager who'd recently joined, approached hesitantly. "Sir," he said, "is it true? What happened in Alabama?" Miles smiled faintly, eyes on the horizon. "It's true enough," he replied. "But what matters isn't what they tried to do. It's what they learned after failing." The boy frowned. "Learned what?" "That hate only wins when it makes you hate back," Miles said softly. "And that strength isn't about hitting harder. It's about standing taller when they expect you to fall." The boy nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "I want to be like that one day." "You already are," Miles answered. "You showed up. That's where it starts." For a moment, the rooftop was silent except for the hum of the city. Miles looked up at the stars and thought of Leon. He could almost hear his friend's laugh, the same laugh that had once echoed through desert nights overseas. "You'd be proud, brother," he whispered. "We're still fighting, just different battles now." Days passed, then weeks. The world spun forward. But the story of that night, the night a racist Klan tried to kill a black man and met a Delta Force commander instead, refused to fade. Schools discussed it. Journalists dissected it. Parents told their children about the man who chose discipline over vengeance, reason over rage. Eventually, a letter arrived in Miles's mailbox. It was from the sheriff of Hollow Ridge. Inside was a photograph. 4 men sitting on a church bench, heads bowed, not as prisoners, but as men seeking forgiveness. Beneath it, a note read, "You were right, Carter. Some things can change. You just have to give them something worth changing for." Miles stared at the picture for a long time before folding it carefully and tucking it into his journal. He didn't forgive easily. Not because he couldn't, but because forgiveness, to him, was something sacred. It had to mean something deeper than words. That night, he wrote in his notebook, a habit from his military days. "A man's greatest battle isn't fought against enemies in the dark. It's fought against the darkness within himself. And victory is choosing peace even when the world demands war." He closed the book and placed it beside Leon's photograph. The same calm filled his chest, the quiet of a soldier who'd finally found his mission beyond combat. Weeks later, Miles gave one final interview before stepping away from public life. When the reporter asked him what he hoped people would remember, he said simply, "That I wasn't a hero. I was a reminder. Every time you choose humanity over hate, you rewrite the ending of someone else's story." Those words became the final quote in every headline, etched into murals, printed on T-shirts, shared in classrooms. But Miles Carter himself vanished from the noise, like smoke carried by the wind, leaving behind not his fame, but his example. Some said he returned to Alabama quietly, to the same graveyard where it all began. Others believed he joined a global peace initiative. No one knew for sure because men like him didn't need to be seen to make an impact. They worked in silence because silence, when driven by purpose, could echo louder than any shout. And so the legend of Hollow Ridge became something larger than fear, larger than hate. It became a parable, a story parents told to their sons who thought anger was strength, and to their daughters who thought silence was safety. It reminded the world that courage isn't found in confrontation, but in compassion that stands unshaken. As dawn broke across another forgotten town, a familiar silhouette walked along a dusty road, duffel bags slung over his shoulder, boots carrying the weight of history but the lightness of peace. Miles Carter didn't look back. He never needed to. Because the road ahead, though uncertain, finally felt worth walking. And as the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in gold and fire, One quiet truth lingered in the air like a vow whispered to the earth itself. You can't kill what refuses to hate.